It was the summer of 1997 when five cousins, Hannah, Caleb, Naomi, Eli, and Grace, stepped through the doors of a quiet Texas lodge and vanished. No witnesses saw them leave. No signs explained their absence. The rooms where they'd been playing were left intact, their belongings scattered, as if they had intended to return at any moment, but they never did. For years, their disappearance sat in FBI files marked unresolved, a case buried beneath layers of speculation, grief, and silence. Only much later would those files be unsealed, revealing a story darker and more intricate than anyone had imagined. That morning had started like any other. Hannah, 15, the eldest, was the natural leader of the group. She carried herself with a seriousness that made adults trust her, but she also had a warmth that drew her younger cousins in close. She wore her long hair pulled back that day, already planning how they'd spend their time at the lodge swimming, exploring trails, maybe ghost stories by the fire. Caleb, 14, followed behind her with restless energy. He had that tendency to wander ahead on trails, or sneak into places marked no entry, a boy who lived in the space between bravery and recklessness. He had been joking all morning, teasing his sisters and tossing pebbles down the gravel road as they walked toward the lodge entrance. Naomi, 12, clutched her small sketchbook, the same one she never went anywhere without. Her world was quieter than her siblings, filtered through the shapes she drew and the words she never quite said aloud. She looked up at the building with cautious eyes, already noticing details. Others ignored the chipped paint on the windowsill, the sway of a tree branch against the roof. Eli, 9, had brought a toy car tucked into his pocket. He was the one who always sought to bridge the gaps between his cousins, distracting them with games whenever arguments sparked. His small frame buzzed with enthusiasm, and he had already asked 3 times if they'd be allowed to roast marshmallows that night. And then there was Grace, only 7, whose wide eyes made everything seem magical. She carried a stuffed rabbit that had long lost one ear, and she refused to sleep without it. To her, the trip to the lodge felt like an adventure, something extraordinary, a world larger than the safe suburban streets she was used to. Together, they walked into the building with the easy rhythm of children who had grown up side by side, trusting the world around them, never suspecting it would betray them so completely. The adults, uncles, aunts, and grandparents were busy unpacking cars, arguing about rooms, and shuffling bags up the narrow stairwell. No one noticed exactly when the cousins slipped away. Only that one moment they were laughing in the hallway, and the next, silence. The clock in the lobby read 11:23 a.m. The heat outside was already pressing against the lodge walls, cicadas droning in endless waves. Inside, the air was cooler but heavy, carrying the faint scent of cedar mixed with dust. The cousins had dropped their backpacks near the couches, shoes kicked carelessly under a wooden bench. Hannah's sweater was draped over the armrest as though she'd be back in seconds. Caleb's comic book lay open on the floor, a page mid-turned. Naomi's sketchbook was balanced on the windowsill, pencil resting across its seam. Eli's toy car sat by the baseboard, where he must have left it mid-game. Grace's rabbit was propped upright against the cushions, its lopsided head watching the room. Evidence of life. Evidence of a pause. But no evidence of where they had gone. The first searches were frantic but limited. Parents combed the building, calling the children's names, opening doors that led to kitchens, storage closets, and unused conference rooms. The surrounding woods swallowed sound, and when their shouts echoed back without answer, panic began to bloom. Within hours, local police had arrived. By nightfall, federal agents were involved. 5 missing children, vanished together. It was unthinkable. The investigation started with the lodge itself. Every door, every window, and every creaking stairwell was cataloged. The basement was checked and the attic opened. Dogs were brought in, their paws scratching against the warped floorboards as they pulled handlers toward faint trails that faded into nothingness. For days, the building was treated like a sealed box. But the box gave up no answers, no sign of struggle, no indication of forced entry or exit, no blood, no fingerprints out of place, nothing. Just silence and belongings left behind. Outside, the woods stretched for miles, dense with pine and oak, crisscrossed by deer paths and old hunting trails. Search parties pushed through undergrowth, voices echoing in uneven chorus. Helicopters swept overhead, their rotors thrumming like anxious hearts. But nothing stirred beneath them except trees bending in the wind. The case quickly grew larger than the town. News crews arrived. Cameras pointed at the faces of grieving parents. Posters went up in gas stations and grocery stores, 5 faces side by side, eyes staring out across highways and back roads. Tips flooded in sightings at diners, whispers at truck stops, shadows on highways, but each one collapsed under scrutiny. And all the while, the lodge sat heavy and mute, its silence deepening with every unanswered question. Years later, when the FBI files were finally unsealed, they revealed what had been hidden in the shadows all along. The truth of what happened inside and beyond that lodge was far stranger and far darker than anyone could have prepared for. The days following the disappearance stretched into each other, a blur of flashing lights, clipped radio transmissions, and parents clinging to photographs of their children as if they were lifelines. The FBI set up a command center in a nearby church hall, its walls soon plastered with maps, aerial photographs, and timelines that grew more chaotic as leads multiplied and collapsed. Hannah's photo hung at the center of the wall, her steady gaze a reminder of the role she had played among the cousins. Beside her, Caleb's grin seemed frozen mid-laugh. Naomi's shy smile, Eli's crooked teeth, and Grace's dimpled cheeks, 5 faces staring back at every agent who entered, demanding answers. Agents interviewed the extended family again and again, pressing for the smallest details. Did the children mention meeting someone new? Did they ever complain about strange cars near their homes? Did they have routines that could be exploited? Each question came back hollow. The cousins had been like any other children, living ordinary lives with ordinary patterns. In the town, fear seeped into daily existence. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter, eyes darting towards strangers at gas pumps and grocery aisles. Teachers locked school doors earlier, keeping students inside during recess. Rumors spread quickly. Some insisted the cousins had been taken by drifters, transient men who moved invisibly along highways. Others whispered about something darker, unspoken dangers in the woods that had always felt too silent after dusk. And then there were those who believed the children had simply run away together, a pact born out of curiosity and defiance. But even that theory crumbled under scrutiny. Hannah had been responsible and protective. Grace was too young and too attached to her stuffed rabbit to willingly leave it behind. They wouldn't have gone willingly, not without leaving some sign. The FBI combed through the lodge records. Each rental and each visitor from the previous months was cataloged. Interviews extended to staff, delivery drivers, and even the mail carrier who had dropped envelopes into the rusting lodge mailbox. Nothing pointed to a suspect. The only anomaly came from a logbook entry on the week of the disappearance. A phone number scrawled without a name beside a reservation inquiry that had never been finalized. The number, when traced, was disconnected. The search expanded outward. Drones didn't yet exist, but helicopters scoured the forest canopy, their infrared equipment searching for heat signatures. Boats dragged the nearby river, divers descending into its dark current with heavy hearts. Dogs tracked faint scents that dissipated before leading anywhere tangible. Each search ended in silence. Each night, families returned home without answers. Investigators tried to reconstruct the cousins' final movements. Witnesses recalled seeing them playing outside around sunset, chasing each other through the long grass behind the lodge. A fisherman claimed he'd heard laughter carrying across the lake as the sun dipped behind the tree line. But by 10 o'clock, the lodge was quiet. No one remembered hearing screams. no shattered glass, and no hurried footsteps. It was as though the night had simply swallowed them whole. Inside the command center, agents debated theories. One suggested a stranger had slipped in and coaxed or forced the cousins into leaving quietly. Another posited they had been lured by someone they trusted, someone who promised them an adventure. A third theory leaned darker still. Multiple perpetrators, organized, waiting for the exact moment the lodge was distracted. None of it fit neatly. 5 children were not easy to conceal. Moving them without sound, without trace, required precision or luck that bordered on the unthinkable. The families began holding vigils. Crowds gathered with candles at the courthouse steps, their flickering flames reflected in the courthouse windows. Volunteers printed thousands of flyers, each one showing the 5 faces lined in a row. Gas stations, diners, and laundromats across Texas bore their images. The cousins became symbols of fear but also of unity. Strangers prayed together, children wore ribbons, and churches rang their bells every evening at the time the cousins were last seen. But as the weeks dragged into months, the optimism fractured. The vigils grew smaller. The flyers faded in the sun. Interviews that once aired at prime time were replaced with other headlines. Agents rotated out, leaving behind thick binders of notes and unresolved questions. For the parents, however, the clock never stopped. Every ring of the phone was a possibility. Every knock at the door carried both hope and dread. Hannah's mother clung to the belief that her daughter's sense of responsibility would somehow lead them back home. Caleb's father grew restless, driving highways late into the night, scanning for any child who might match his son's build. Naomi's quiet sketches, left behind in her notebook, were studied as if they might contain clues. Eli's toy car was carried in his brother's pocket until the paint wore away. Grace's rabbit, the earless stuffed companion, became a shrine in itself, propped against her bed as though waiting for her return. Years later, when the FBI files were finally made public, they showed just how many leads had evaporated into nothingness. Tips about men in pickup trucks, abandoned cabins, and suspicious neighbors, each one carefully followed, each one meticulously documented, and each one ending the same way, inconclusive. Yet within those same files lay fragments, overlooked details that only in hindsight suggested a pattern. A series of cigarette butts was found behind the lodge, fibers that didn't belong to the family. A disconnected number scrawled in a logbook, the outline of something that was always there but never fully seen. In 1997, though, all the families could do was wait. Wait and wonder what had happened in those hours between laughter at sunset and silence at dawn. Wait and wonder who or what had been watching their children. The lodge remained locked under evidence tape, its empty windows reflecting the faces of parents who stared too long, searching for answers that would not come. And as the seasons turned, the case grew cold. But the silence it left behind did not fade. It lingered in the town, in the woods, and in the hearts of those who had once believed 5 children could simply walk into the night and return by morning. They never did. By the end of that first year, the posters had curled at the edges, their colors fading under the relentless Texas sun. The lodge itself was shuttered, its driveway blocked with a rusting chain and a weathered sign that warned no trespassing. For locals, the building became a place of avoidance, a silhouette glimpsed from the road but never approached. Parents told their children not to wander too close, as though the silence inside might spread. But the families had no such luxury. For them, the lodge was not just a building. It was the last place their children had been alive, the last known boundary between normal life and the unexplainable. The case, officially, was cold. Investigators rotated to other assignments, their reports filed neatly in cabinets where dust gathered. Leads grew stale, and informants stopped calling. The only thing left was the weight of absence. At dinner tables, there were empty chairs that no one could bring themselves to remove. Bedrooms became shrines, preserved exactly as they'd been in July of 1997. Calendars hung on walls, with dates circled in red. Anniversaries of birthdays that passed without candles or laughter. For Hannah's mother, the pain was sharpened by memory. She often pictured her daughter on that final evening, standing by the window with her arms crossed, watching the younger ones play. Hannah had always been protective, the one to remind Caleb not to wander too far, the one who tied Grace's shoelaces in double knots so she wouldn't trip. She had carried the quiet authority of someone older than her years, and her mother clung to the belief that Hannah would have fought, resisted, and tried to leave some trace. The absence of that trace haunted her most of all. Caleb's father grew restless. He drove long highways at night, headlights sweeping through endless stretches of pine, chasing rumors he knew were hollow. Once, he pulled over at a truck stop where someone swore they'd seen a boy with Caleb's grin. He ran through the aisles, calling his son's name, only to find strangers staring back in confusion. He never stopped searching, never stopped answering the phone on the first ring, convinced one day it would be his son's voice on the other end. Naomi's parents kept her sketchbook on their coffee table, its pages worn from being opened too often. Inside were landscapes, trees rendered in delicate pencil lines, and faces of cousins laughing. On the very last page she had drawn the outline of the lodge itself, its windows shaded dark, the trees around it looming larger than life. It was unfinished, as though she had been interrupted mid-stroke. Her parents studied that page endlessly, wondering if Naomi had known something, sensed something, or captured in lines of graphite what words could not say. Eli's older brother carried the boy's toy car in his pocket until the paint wore away. He remembered Eli's laugh, and the way he always tried to smooth arguments, a peacemaker even at 9 years old. He often replayed that final afternoon in his mind. Eli on the porch steps, rolling the toy along the railing, humming to himself while the others bickered about which game to play. That hum still echoed in his memory, growing louder in silence. And then there was Grace, the youngest, frozen in time at 7 years old. Her bed remained untouched, the earless rabbit propped against her pillow. Her parents often sat in that room at night, listening for the sound of footsteps that would never come. They remembered her last words before the lodge trip. "Don't forget my rabbit." They hadn't. The rabbit was still there, waiting, long after Grace was gone. The town carried the weight as well. For a while, vigils continued, candles lit in the courthouse square, prayers murmured in the church basement. But over time, those gatherings dwindled. People returned to their routines, unwilling to keep staring into the void. Whispers filled the silence instead. Some swore the children had been taken by someone they knew, a trusted figure who had slipped unnoticed into their lives. Others insisted the woods themselves had claimed them, swallowed them into some darkness beyond comprehension. Parents warned their children never to wander alone, but no one ever said the cousins' names too loudly, as though invoking them might invite the same fate. Inside the FBI files, though, the story never fully stopped. Periodically, evidence was retested as technology advanced. The cigarette butts collected from behind the lodge yielded partial DNA years later, but no match could be made in national databases. Fibers from the sheets upstairs were synthetic, unusual, and not linked to any clothing the children had owned. And there were witness statements tucked into the back of files that seemed strange in hindsight. A delivery driver who recalled seeing a van parked near the road the day before. A hunter who swore he'd heard voices in the woods around midnight, though he couldn't say if they belonged to children or adults. At the time, those fragments led nowhere, but they lingered in reports, waiting for the day they might mean something more. The families aged in grief. Birthdays passed, holidays marked by absence. Photographs of the cousins remained the same year after year. 5 frozen faces pinned to refrigerators and bulletin boards. What hurt most was the passage of time, of what they might look like now, how their voices might have deepened, how their laughter might have changed. They were never found, never confirmed dead, and never confirmed alive. Just gone. suspended between hope and despair. Every so often, a new rumor would spark. A sighting in another state, a teenager with similar eyes, a young woman with a scar that matched Grace's from a childhood fall. Each one reignited the fire. Each one ended in disappointment. The community stopped believing, but the parents couldn't. They lived in that space between, clinging to the smallest thread. The lodge remained empty, its walls rotting, windows boarded. But inside, the air still held the weight of absence, as if time itself had stalled that summer night. Those who entered after the police tape was removed swore they could feel it, a heaviness that settled in their chests, pressing down like an invisible hand. The beds upstairs were still there, mattresses bare, but the outlines of where children once slept were visible in the dust. It was a place that remembered, even when the world tried to forget. And as the years slipped by, the FBI files thickened, silent pages, waiting for the moment when someone would return to them, searching for the truth hidden in plain sight. For more than a decade, the case existed in shadows, a ghost story whispered across Texas. But inside the FBI's archives, the story had never truly died. The files swelled with reports, evidence slips, and handwritten notes, each detail catalogued but left unresolved. What they revealed, years later, was not only what had been missed in those first frantic days, but also what may have been deliberately buried. Among the earliest reports was the statement of a lodge caretaker. He had lived on the property in a small outbuilding, maintaining the grounds in exchange for free rent. On the night of the disappearance, he swore he had seen headlights on the access road sometime after midnight. The lights had stopped, then shut off, leaving only the silhouette of a van against the tree line. He had mentioned it to deputies in passing, but his words never made it into the official case summary. When the files were re-examined years later, his interview transcript sat buried among routine paperwork, the kind of detail overlooked when panic clouds clarity. The cigarette butts collected near the porch were another overlooked clue. Initially dismissed as belonging to searchers or passers-by, they were later tested when DNA technology advanced. The profiles extracted didn't match any family members, investigators, or registered lodge guests. Instead, they pointed to an unknown male, his identity absent from every database available at the time. Yet for reasons no one could fully explain, those results weren't circulated beyond the core investigation team. In later reviews, some agents whispered that sharing the data might have risked exposing connections too close to home. And then there were the fibers. Thin synthetic strands were found on the upstairs bed where Grace had last been seen. They did not match any bedding or clothing cataloged from the lodge, and their chemical composition was unusual industrial, resistant to heat and abrasion, the kind used in specialized gear. The lab reports flagged them as potentially significant, but the case had already gone cold by the time the results came back. The evidence was boxed and filed, marked pending further analysis. It never received any. What struck later reviewers most, however, were the inconsistencies in witness accounts. In the initial chaos, locals reported everything from strange cars to unusual noises in the woods. One man described seeing two figures moving along the dirt road at dawn, one taller, one shorter, dragging something between them. Another swore he'd heard children's voices carried on the wind hours after the cousins were declared missing. The accounts were contradictory, unreliable, and often tainted by rumor. But when read together, they painted an unsettling picture. Someone had been there. Not one person, but more. And they had moved through the night with a purpose. The FBI's files also revealed tension between federal agents and local law enforcement. Deputies insisted the lodge should be treated as the primary crime scene and scoured for hidden entrances, secret crawl spaces, and even tunnels left from its oil boom history. But FBI supervisors pushed resources outward, convinced the children had been transported off-site immediately. The clash of priorities left gaps in the room, inadequately processed, potential witnesses dismissed. By the time agreement was reached, the trail had cooled beyond recovery. Families had long suspected details were being withheld. They spoke of conversations with agents that hinted at leads never pursued, and questions that lingered but were never answered. Years later, when the files emerged, those suspicions seemed less like grief-driven paranoia and more like glimpses of a truth carefully controlled. The files revealed another detail, small but chilling. In the weeks before the disappearance, multiple families had noticed someone watching. Hannah's mother remembered a man at the grocery store, standing too long in the produce aisle, eyes fixed on her daughter. Naomi's father recalled headlights idling near their street after dark, vanishing when he stepped outside. Grace's parents had once found a note tucked under their windshield wiper blank, except for the faint outline of a hand pressed in dust. They had brushed it off at the time, coincidences magnified by hindsight. But within the FBI reports, the similarities were undeniable. Someone had been circling them long before the lodge. Even the timing raised questions. The cousins disappeared on the one night their parents were absent, attending a wedding across town. It was a detail no one outside the family should have known. And yet whoever acted that night had chosen it with precision, striking when the children were most vulnerable, when the adults were distracted. The files hinted at inside knowledge, suggesting the possibility that the perpetrator or perpetrators had been closer to the family than anyone wanted to believe. As the years dragged on, the FBI files remained sealed, classified under ongoing investigation. Families fought for access, filing appeals, writing letters to congressmen, and begging for transparency. When portions were finally released more than a decade later, they painted a picture not of certainty, but of chaos, contradictions, oversights, and missed opportunities stacked like dominoes. But buried within the noise, a pattern began to emerge. The fibers, the cigarette butts, the caretaker's headlights, the disconnected number in the lodge logbook, each on its own could be dismissed. But together they whispered of something organized, something premeditated. The children hadn't been lost to the woods or the river. They had been taken with precision, with planning, with knowledge no stranger should have had. The revelation reignited the family's grief. The idea that answers had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, was unbearable. For some, it deepened their obsession, pushing them to track every lead independently, to hire private investigators who uncovered still more inconsistencies. For others, it hollowed them further, leaving only exhaustion where hope had once been. And yet, for all the fragments, the files never named a suspect. They never confirmed who had watched the cousins, who had followed them, or who had waited in the shadows of the lodge. The mystery endured, thick as the pine forest itself. But the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with questions, with evidence, with the certainty that someone had been there, unseen, and had left without a trace. The files described the cousins' final night in fragments, testimonies, timelines, and scraps of evidence that together formed a mosaic blurred by time. To the families, though, those hours were still sharp. Each detail carried like a scar. What haunted them most was how ordinary the evening had seemed. Hannah had taken charge, as she always did. She organized a card game in the lodge's upstairs living room, shuffling the deck with a focus that made the younger ones laugh. Caleb sprawled across the rug, restless as ever, sneaking glances at the windows as though longing for the woods just beyond. Naomi sat nearby, with her sketchbook balanced on her knees, pencil whispering across paper as she captured the curve of the fireplace. Eli rolled his toy car along the wooden coffee table, narrating its crashes and spins, his voice rising in a steady rhythm. Grace clutched her rabbit, giggling when Caleb made faces at her from behind Hannah's back. The caretaker, who would later give his overlooked statement, recalled seeing the upstairs lights flicker off around 10 o'clock. He assumed the children had gone to bed. But the FBI files noted something else, A neighbor across the lake reported hearing faint laughter carried on the water just after midnight. The timeline didn't align. The lodge should have been silent by then. Either the children had stayed awake, or someone else's voice had echoed in that night air. Later reanalysis of the lodge itself revealed details missed in the first sweep. Dust samples taken from the upstairs hallway contained particles of soil not native to the lodge grounds. Under a microscope, analysts identified traces of crushed granite mixed with oil residue, the kind found on industrial roads miles away. Someone had walked those halls that night, carrying dust from somewhere far beyond the forest. In flashbacks reconstructed by investigators, the children likely fell asleep scattered across the lodge. Hannah and Naomi are upstairs, their belongings folded neatly by their beds. Caleb stretched out on the floor, refusing to take the smaller bed when his sister teased him about snoring. Eli curled in a chair, with his toy still clutched in his hand. Grace, as always, nestled against her rabbit. Ordinary positions, ordinary dreams, until something shifted. The unlocked back door became the focal point of FBI analysis. Photographs showed no signs of forced entry. No broken lock, no splintered wood. Whoever entered either had a key or was let in. One theory suggested the cousins may have trusted the intruder, someone familiar enough to ease their fear. Another posited that they had been sleeping too deeply, taken one by one in silence. But the files contained another strange note. The back door frame bore faint impressions, circular indentations too regular to be natural wear. Years later, an expert identified them as marks from a lock bypass tool. Someone had slipped in with practiced ease, leaving behind only the faintest trace. The idea that the cousins had been awake when it happened haunted the families most. Caleb's father often wondered if his son had resisted, fought back, or tried to run. The files did mention a scuff mark on the staircase, wood-chipped as if by a shoe dragged hard against it. Was it Caleb or Hannah, pulling one of the younger ones close? The evidence was never answered. It only suggested a struggle too small, too brief, to leave behind more. The cigarette butts behind the porch told another story. In the first investigation, they were ignored. But years later, the DNA profiles were matched partially to a convicted offender in another state. The match was not strong enough to name him definitively, but strong enough to raise questions. He had been arrested for abductions near campgrounds, known to target children when parents were distracted. The timeline overlapped with the cousin's disappearance. He had been in Texas that summer. The FBI's files marked it as inconclusive, insufficient for charges. But to the families, the coincidence felt more like confirmation. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. The flashbacks, interwoven with the files, created a chilling image. Hannah shuffling cards, Naomi sketching. Eli was humming as his toy rolled across the table, Grace hugging her rabbit tight. Caleb glanced at the window, restless, sensing something none of them could articulate. And outside, in the stillness of the woods, a van was waiting with its headlights off. A figure smoking behind the porch, watching the upstairs lights wink out one by one. Knowledge of the parents' absence, knowledge of the children's routines, knowledge precise enough to act in silence. Years later, when parents reread the files, they lingered on the smallest details. Soil dust is not from the lodge. Fibers from clothing their children never owned. Witness statements about figures moving through the trees. Each detail on its own meant little. But together they formed the shadow of that night, a shape growing clearer the longer one stared. The FBI's reanalysis also raised a question that had never been asked in 1997. Why all 5? Abductions were often singular, opportunistic, and focused on one vulnerable child. Taking 5 required planning, capacity, and control. Whoever acted that night had not stumbled upon opportunity. They had orchestrated it, chosen the lodge, chosen the night, and chosen the moment when laughter turned to silence. And yet, for all the evidence, there were still no bodies, no proof of life, and no definitive end. The families clung to that void, painful as it was, because in the absence of answers, there was still possibility. But the files carried a different weight. They suggested the cousin's disappearance had not been an accident or a wandering into the woods. It had been deliberate, calculated, a crime buried beneath silence for years. The FBI's files did not close the case. They did something worse. They opened doors to possibilities darker than anyone had prepared for. And with each re-examined fragment, it became clear. The cousins had not simply vanished. They had been taken, and the one who took them had known exactly what they were doing. When the reanalysis findings were finally shown to the families, the room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to smother the air itself. Stacks of photocopied reports were spread across the long table, each page a reminder that evidence had always existed, tucked away but never acted on. Mothers and fathers who had clung to hope for a decade found themselves staring at details that suggested something far darker than wandering children. Hannah's mother traced her fingers along the printout of the cigarette butt DNA. The partial match to a man already convicted in another state was a wound that reopened old questions. "He was here," she whispered, though no one could confirm it fully. Caleb's father slammed a fist against the table, anger spilling over. And they buried it. They had him all along, and they buried it. The agents in the room said nothing. Their silence was enough explanation. For Naomi's parents, it was the fibers that unsettled them most. Industrial strands woven into bedding, where their daughter should have been safe. They had imagined Naomi asleep, her sketchbook by her side, her pencil still warm from use. Now they pictured strangers standing over her, clothed in fabrics meant for something other than comfort, fibers clinging to her bed like scars. Eli's older brother, grown now, clenched his jaw at the photograph of the staircase scuff. "He fought," he said quietly, though the report only called it inconclusive. "He tried. They all did." His voice carried the conviction of someone who refused to let his little brother's final moments be anything less than defiant. Grace's parents stared at the image of the back door, the faint circular indentations from a bypass tool. The knowledge that someone had slipped so easily into the lodge, into the very heart of their children's safety, hollowed them. Grace's father pressed his palm against the table as if to steady himself, while her mother clutched the stuffed rabbit they had brought to every meeting for years. The rabbit's missing ear flopped sideways, a silent witness to every revelation. The FBI agents tried to steer the discussion toward procedure, how new leads might be followed, how advances in technology could finally yield answers. But the family's questions cut deeper. Who had accessed the files all these years? Why were leads ignored? How could soil samples from miles away, fibers from clothing not their own, and a caretaker's testimony of headlights be overlooked? The agents offered no real answers. Some files, they admitted, had been deprioritized as resources shifted to newer cases. Others may have been lost in the sheer chaos of the initial search. But beneath the bureaucratic explanations lingered something heavier, the possibility that truths had been withheld deliberately. The reanalysis did spark new directions. Task forces were assembled, smaller this time, focused on combing through every overlooked witness statement. The caretaker was re-interviewed, now older, his voice rough with years of silence. He repeated his story of the headlights, insisting he had seen the van and remembered the way it lingered before disappearing into the trees. A hunter was tracked down and asked again about the voices he'd heard. This time, he swore they had been children's voices, high and frightened, cutting through the night air before fading. But the files also contained names. Men and women were interviewed in the days after the disappearance, some with flimsy alibis, others with connections that were never fully explored. One was a former lodge employee who had left abruptly weeks before the cousins vanished. Another was a truck driver whose roots placed him near the area that summer, later convicted of unrelated crimes against children. And then there was the man tied to the cigarette DNA, a drifter, known for stalking campgrounds, who disappeared himself in the early 2000s. His file was thin, incomplete, and riddled with gaps. But his shadow loomed over every page. Patterns began to emerge: campsites near highways, isolated lodges. Children were left unsupervised for brief moments. The FBI files hinted at connections between unsolved disappearances across state lines, a web of silence stretching further than the families had ever imagined. The idea that the cousins' case was not an isolated event, but part of something larger, was a truth too heavy to bear. And yet, once seen, it could not be ignored. For the families, the revelations brought no closure. They lived in the space between grief and fury, their lives split into before and after. Hannah, Caleb, Naomi, Eli, and Grace had been gone for over a decade, yet the files made their absence feel immediate and fresh. It was as if they had just walked out of the room, leaving behind a trail of fragments that no one had bothered to follow until now. The community, too, felt the shift. News of the FBI files reignited old fears. Neighbors remembered strange vehicles parked near the lodge that summer, men seen loitering in diners, and conversations half overheard in gas stations. Memories long buried resurfaced, stitched together by hindsight. For the first time in years, the lodge was spoken of again, not as an abandoned building, but as the epicenter of a crime that had never truly gone away. Still, the most chilling part of the files was not what they contained, but what they didn't. Pages were missing, entire sections blacked out by redactions. Witnesses' names withheld, investigative notes erased. It suggested knowledge kept deliberately out of reach, answers that existed but were not for the families to see. Each black outline was a silence that screamed louder than words. The families left that meeting more fractured than before. Some clung tighter to hope, convinced the new leads would finally uncover the truth. Others sank deeper into despair, believing the answers had always been there, hidden by those who should have revealed them. All of them carried the same weight: their children's laughter, frozen in memory, paired forever with the silence of the lodge. The reanalysis had not solved the case. It had done something more dangerous. It had reignited it, and with that flame came the shadows of suspects long forgotten, waiting for their names to be spoken again. When investigators revisited the old files, the suspect list sprawled like tangled roots, each name sprouting from rumors, coincidences, and forgotten testimonies. But as the task force peeled back layers of redacted reports, one truth became undeniable. There had been people circling the lodge long before the night Hannah, Caleb, Naomi, Eli, and Grace disappeared. One file described a former lodge employee who had resigned just weeks before the abduction. He had worked maintenance, often lingering after hours, his presence rarely questioned. In his interview, he claimed he left because of poor pay, but witnesses described him watching families too intently, lingering near playgrounds, and volunteering for tasks that kept him close to children. At the time, no evidence linked him directly to the cousins' disappearance. But the FBI files revealed something investigators hadn't pursued. He lived less than 2 miles from the access road where the caretaker had seen headlights that night. His alibi, a vague reference to visiting relatives, was never verified. His name appeared, then faded into silence. Another file detailed the truck driver. His routes took him through East Texas in July of 1997, his logs confirming stops at gas stations not far from the lodge. He was later convicted in another state for crimes against minors, his method eerily similar: isolating children in remote areas and coaxing them with promises before overpowering them. In his possessions, years later, investigators found souvenirs, trinkets, belonging to children whose families had never seen them again, no item tied directly to the cousins. Still, the parallels were chilling. His presence in the area at the time of their disappearance was a thread that should have been pulled harder, yet in the chaos of that summer, it was not. But the most disturbing name was tied to the cigarette butts. The partial DNA match pointed to a man who drifted through Texas during the mid-90s. Arrest records showed a history of abduction attempts, though many charges never stuck. He was transient, slipping between states, vanishing before authorities could fully build a case. In one chilling note, buried in the files, a detective scrawled a line: known to watch campsites, waits for parents to leave. Preferred groups say they trust each other more when they go together. The phrase, "read like a blueprint" of what had happened at the lodge. The task force began piecing together behavioral patterns. Children rarely vanished in groups of 5. Such crimes required not only opportunity, but also control, planning, and an understanding of fear. Files revealed that predators with such methods often relied on familiarity. They blended into communities, built trust, then struck when the chance aligned. The cousins' disappearance, once believed to be a random act, began to look more like a carefully orchestrated event. The re-examined interviews painted an unsettling picture. A fisherman on the lake recalled a van parked on the access road days before the disappearance, its driver sitting behind the wheel, watching the water for hours without fishing. A gas station clerk remembered a man matching the drifter's description buying candy, his eyes fixed on children near the soda machines. A teenage girl, interviewed years later, said she'd been approached by a stranger near the lodge that summer, who asked if she wanted to see something in the woods. She had run, but the memory lingered. None of these accounts were pursued in 1997. By the time agents circled back, memories had blurred, witnesses had moved, and evidence was gone. The files also contained a section of suppressed interviews, later unsealed with heavy redactions. One was with a local boy, 13 at the time, who admitted he had been near the lodge that night. He described hearing voices and laughter that turned quickly to shouting. He swore he saw figures of 2 adults moving quickly across the yard, shepherding smaller shapes between them. But his account was dismissed as unreliable, written off as a child's imagination. Rereading the transcript years later, investigators saw not fantasy, but consistency with other overlooked testimonies. The boy had described details only someone present could know. The squeak of the lodge's back screen door, the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. As suspicion narrowed, the families wrestled with unbearable possibilities. Could it have been someone they knew? Someone who attended the same grocery store, the same church? Someone who smiled politely in passing while plotting their children's disappearance? The FBI's files did not answer, but they raised questions too sharp to ignore. Patterns stretched wider. In the years before and after 1997, other cases dotted the map. Children missing from campgrounds in Arkansas, a pair of siblings vanishing from a motel in Oklahoma, and a teenager abducted near a highway rest stop in Louisiana. All unsolved. All with details that echoed the cousins' case. Vehicles with no license plates. Witnesses describing cigarette smoke in the air. Groups of children were targeted when adults were momentarily absent. The files hinted at a predator who did not act once, but many times, moving across states, leaving only silence in their wake. And yet, for all the shadows named, there was no single truth pinned down. Each suspect was both plausible and unproven. Each file heavy with suspicion, but light on evidence. The families clung to fragments. Hannah's unfinished sweater draped on the couch. Naomi's sketch of the lodge. Eli's chipped toy car. Grace's rabbit. And Caleb's comic book left mid-page. Each item, ordinary in itself, became a relic. Together they were proof the cousins had been there. And someone else had been too. What the FBI files revealed most clearly was not certainty, but intent. Whoever had taken them had planned. They had waited. They had known. And they had left no trace except fragments scattered like breadcrumbs that no one bothered to follow until it was too late. The task force knew then what the families had suspected all along. The cousins had not vanished. They had been watched, chosen, and taken with precision. and the man or men responsible had walked away into the darkness of the woods, leaving the lodge forever haunted. The final wave of analysis within the FBI files was the most haunting. After years of silence, investigators dared to piece together not just fragments of evidence, but a timeline, a reconstruction of what might have happened inside that lodge after the laughter faded and the lights went out. At the heart of this reconstruction were the suppressed interviews. One belonged to a woman who had worked as a cleaner at the lodge. Her statement had been tucked into an appendix, uncirculated. She described a van parked in the lot in the days before the cousins vanished. Its driver, she said, had asked unusual questions about how late the lodge stayed unlocked, how many guests it usually held, and whether the upstairs rooms had locks. She remembered the unease crawling along her skin when he smiled too long, but she never saw him again. That statement never made it into the primary case files. When unearthed years later, it read like a warning unheeded. Another testimony came from a gas station attendant who remembered selling fuel to a man in the early hours of the morning when the cousins disappeared. The man had been sweaty, nervous, and chain-smoking as he filled an old van. The attendant recalled the smell of cedar on his clothes, as though he had been deep in the woods. But he had no license plate to report, no receipt to trace. His statement had been logged, but not pursued. The soil samples, once dismissed, became central to the reconstruction. Investigators confirmed the crushed granite mixed with oil residue came not from the lodge, but from an access road leading to an abandoned quarry miles away. Forensic teams followed that trail years later, walking through brush thick with vines, until they found the remnants of a campsite long abandoned, fire pit cold, but littered with artifacts. Among the debris lay fragments of synthetic fibers, identical to those found in the lodge. It was as if the road itself had pointed all along to the place where the children had been taken. But the most chilling discovery came from an audio tape. Buried deep in the files was a recording from a phone tip received months after the disappearance. The caller never gave a name. His voice was distorted, low, and almost mechanical. He claimed to have seen the cousins in the back of a van traveling north on the highway. When asked for details, he whispered, "They weren't crying. They were quiet. Too quiet." Then the line went dead. The tape was never released to the families, never aired publicly. When agents revisited it years later, they debated whether the caller had been a witness or the perpetrator himself. From these fragments, a picture emerged. Investigators believed the cousins had likely been asleep when the back door was bypassed. Hannah may have stirred. The scuff mark on the staircase was perhaps hers, but control had been swift. The cigarette butts and caretaker's testimony pointed to at least 2 adults. One entered while another waited outside. The children were moved quickly, perhaps carried, perhaps coaxed, but together, always together. Witnesses hearing voices in the woods suggested they were shepherded like a group, frightened but silenced, and kept compliant by fear and familiarity. The quarry campsite suggested what came next. The fibers, the soil, and the proximity to the highway all aligned. It was remote enough for concealment and close enough for escape. Investigators imagined the cousins gathered around a fire, not by choice, but by force. Their belongings left behind at the lodge to erase the trail. The audio tape haunted the reconstruction most of all, the quiet that should not have been. Children taken from their beds should have screamed, but the voice insisted they be silent, too silent. Some speculated they had been drugged, sedated, to prevent resistance. Others believed they had been threatened into stillness, bound by the fear of what might happen to a sibling if they spoke. The files did not say what happened after the quarry. From there, the trail dissolved. No bodies were found, and no confirmed sightings were traced. Theories multiplied. Some believed they were transported across state lines, hidden in the network of highways and truck stops the suspects frequented. Others whispered of darker fates, of shallow graves still waiting beneath pine and stone. But the certainty was this: the lodge had not been the end. It had been the beginning. For the families, reading these reconstructions was agony. Hannah's mother pictured her daughter trying to protect the younger ones, her voice steady even as her own fear grew. Caleb's father imagined his son restless even in captivity, plotting ways to break free. Naomi's parents thought of her unfinished sketchbook, wondering if she had tried to draw even in those final hours. Eli's brother held his toy car tighter, convinced Eli would have tried to comfort the others, whispering promises in the dark. Grace's parents clutched her rabbit, picturing her wide eyes staring at strangers, too young to understand, but old enough to know she was in danger. The reconstruction gave no closure. It offered no bodies, no arrests, and no names, but it gave form to the silence, a shape to the void. The cousins had not vanished into thin air. They had been led from the lodge into the woods, taken to a place that still bore traces of their presence, and then carried beyond. The files ended with the same haunting phrase, repeated across multiple reports: presumed victims of organized abduction, final whereabouts unknown. And yet, buried in the margins, one agent had scrawled a line that lingered like a shadow over every page. They were never supposed to disappear. They were supposed to be replaced. The handwritten note in the margins of the FBI file was only 7 words long, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. They were never supposed to disappear. They were supposed to be replaced. Investigators who revisited the files years later argued about its meaning. Some dismissed it as speculation, scribbled during the fog of frustration. Others insisted it pointed to a theory so disturbing it was deliberately kept from the families. The replacement theory first surfaced in an internal memo dated 6 months after the disappearance. It suggested the cousins were not chosen at random, nor solely as victims of opportunity. Instead, the children may have been targeted for a purpose. The memo referenced other unsolved cases where children vanished only for new identities to appear elsewhere. Children whose documentation seemed too perfect, whose guardian stories crumbled under scrutiny. The implication was unthinkable: that children had been taken, reshaped, and absorbed into new lives under different names. In the cousins' case, there were details that lent the theory weight. Grace's rabbit had been left behind, but her shoes had not. Caleb's comic book lay open on the rug, but his backpack was missing. Hannah's sweater draped over the couch, but the necklace she wore daily was nowhere to be found. Naomi's sketchbook sat on the windowsill, but her favorite pencils had vanished with her. Eli's toy car remained by the baseboard, but the second one he always carried, a red matchbox truck, was gone. These gaps suggested select belongings were taken with the children, as if to carry fragments of identity into whatever came next. One suppressed interview seemed to point directly toward this. A nurse from a clinic 2 states away claimed she had seen a group of children in 1998 who resembled the missing cousins. They were accompanied by an older man who insisted they were his grandchildren. The children were quiet and subdued, their eyes cast downward. The nurse remembered one of the girls clutching a sketchbook. She reported the incident, but by the time agents arrived, the clinic's records had been altered. The visit never officially happened. Her testimony was buried in the files, marked unsubstantiated. The replacement theory also drew on the phrase from the anonymous audio tape: they weren't crying, they were quiet. Too quiet. Agents speculated the children may have been conditioned, silenced not just by fear but by manipulation. Predators who trafficked children often worked in networks, training their victims to accept new names and new lives, erasing their old ones with threats or drugs. It was a theory so grim it bordered on conspiracy, yet the files contained too many echoes to ignore. The quarry campsite deepened the suspicion. Among the debris found years later were remnants of children's clothing that did not match what the cousins had been wearing the day they disappeared. Analysts noted the sizes were inconsistent, some too large, others too small. It was as if garments had been swapped, exchanged, and tried on. Alongside them were fragments of burned paper, barely legible, but enough to make out words like adoption and certificate. The report flagged these as anomalies, but no further action was taken. For the families, learning of the replacement theory was like reopening the wound with salt. Hannah's mother asked the question none of them wanted voiced. If they're alive, do they even know who they are anymore? Caleb's father rejected the theory outright, furious at the implication his son could have been turned into someone else. Naomi's parents clung to the possibility, however slim, that their daughter had survived, her sketches hidden somewhere in another life. Eli's brother grew silent, his jaw tight, while Grace's parents wept, clutching the rabbit that had never left her bed. The files suggested the FBI had pursued the replacement angle quietly, mapping potential networks, but progress was slow. Names of organizations were blacked out, and locations were redacted. It was clear there had been whispers of something larger than one night at a lodge, but the specifics were swallowed in ink. What remained visible was a chilling summary. If replacement is confirmed, recovery chances decrease exponentially after 12 months. Psychological reprogramming renders subjects unrecognizable, even to family. Yet not all agents agreed. One wrote in the margins, "Too elaborate. This was control, not replacement." Another countered, "Control is replacement. They become what they're told to be." The debate was never resolved. It only deepened the sense that the cousins' disappearance was not an isolated act of violence, but part of a system designed to erase and rebuild. Even in their absence, the cousins haunted the reconstruction. Hannah, protective, may have resisted longest, her willpower bent toward shielding the others. Caleb, restless, may have tested boundaries and been punished for disobedience. Naomi, quiet, may have retreated inward, clinging to drawings as her last tether. Eli, the peacemaker, may have tried to hold them together in whispers when the adults weren't listening. Grace, the youngest, may have adapted quickest, too small to fully grasp the wrongness, too trusting to question the lies. Each possibility was torture. Each one imagined through the lens of who they had been, not who they might have been forced to become. The replacement theory was never shared publicly. To do so would have meant admitting that the search had never been for children in danger, but for children already transformed. To reveal that truth would have collapsed faith in law enforcement, destroyed hope, and raised questions that could not be answered. So the files were sealed, redacted, and tucked away. The families were told nothing. But when those words surfaced years later, supposed to be replaced, they cast a shadow over everything. The lodge, the quarry, the van with no plates, the cigarette butts, the fibers, the missing shoes and pencils. All of it took on a darker shape. The cousins had not just been stolen. They had been intended for something else, something far more insidious. And if that was true, then silence was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of someone else's design. The final pages of the FBI files carried no resolution, only the bureaucratic weight of closure without clarity. The official line, repeated across summaries and press releases, was stark. 5 minors presumed abducted, final whereabouts unknown. That phrase became the closest thing to an ending the families would ever be given. It appeared in case synopses, in interagency memos, and in the closing remarks of supervisors who had long since retired. To the outside world, it was a tidy summary. To those who had lived the loss, it was unbearable. Inside the files, though, the reality was anything but tidy. Stacked between redacted lines and abandoned leads were fragments that refused to disappear. The cigarette butt's DNA matched, but was never proven. The quarry campsite was littered with fibers and scraps that spoke of children once present. The testimonies of witnesses who swore they saw figures moving in the dark, voices crying out, and headlights idling near the trees. The note scrawled in the margin, supposed to be replaced. Each fragment contradicted closure. Each one suggested a truth still waiting to be told. The families carried those fragments like talismans. Hannah's mother folded copies of the reports into a binder she kept by her bedside, reading them on sleepless nights. Caleb's father drove to the quarry more times than he could count, sitting in silence, staring at the clearing until dawn broke. Naomi's parents framed her unfinished sketch of the lodge and hung it above their mantel, a reminder of both her absence and her presence. Eli's brother carried the matchbox truck, chipped and fading, in his pocket as he grew older, proof of a bond that could not be erased by time or distance. Grace's parents left her rabbit untouched on her bed, its missing ear an emblem of the years she would never live at home. For the community, the lodge became a symbol. It stood abandoned for years, its windows broken, its porch sagging, weeds rising tall around it. Teenagers dared each other to approach, whispering about the children who had vanished there. Hunters avoided the woods nearby, uneasy with the silence. Even after the building was finally torn down, the ground itself seemed scarred, as though memory lingered in the soil. What haunted most was the possibility. The replacement theory, whispered in redacted memos, was never confirmed, but never disproven. If the cousins had been absorbed into other lives, reshaped into identities not their own, then they might still be alive, walking in another town, answering to another name, believing another set of parents were theirs. It was a possibility both hopeful and cruel. Hopeful because it meant survival. Cruel because survival might mean erasure. For Hannah, that meant she might have grown into the protector she had always been, but with no memory of who she once shielded. For Caleb, perhaps his restless grin remained, but directed toward strangers who thought they knew him. Naomi's hands might still sketch, but under a different name scrawled on the corner of each page. Eli might still be smoothing quarrels, but for siblings who were not his own. Grace, the youngest, might never have remembered the rabbit at all. The FBI files, in their redacted silence, left the families suspended in that unbearable in-between. They were told their children were presumed gone, but never given proof. They were told the case was closed, but shown fragments that said otherwise. They were given theories too dark to accept, but too plausible to dismiss. And so they lived in limbo, haunted by both grief and possibility. Anniversaries became rituals of absence. Each July, candles are lit in rows. Each year, prayers were whispered into a sky that had never answered. Some families stopped attending, their grief too raw to display. Others clung to the gatherings, unwilling to let the cousins fade into forgotten headlines. The names Hannah, Caleb, Naomi, Eli, and Grace were spoken like incantations, reminders that they had once been flesh and laughter, not just case numbers. For the agents who had worked the case, the files became ghosts of their own. Some retired, with the cousins' faces still pinned above their desks, unable to box them away. Others confessed in interviews that it was the one case that never let them sleep. A few admitted privately what the families had always suspected, that the truth was larger than one night at a lodge, that the 5 cousins were threads in a darker pattern stretching across states, across years. A pattern too vast, too shadowed, to ever fully name. In the end, the legacy of the case was silence. Silence in the woods, where laughter once echoed. Silence in the lodge, boarded and rotting until it collapsed. Silence in the homes where bedrooms remained untouched, shrines to children who never returned. Silence in the files, black lines blotting out the names of those who may have known the truth. Silence that carried on long after the press moved on, long after the public forgot. But silence is not absence. The cousins remain in every fragment, every rumor, every redacted page. Their presence lingers in the quarry soil, in the cigarette butts, and in the fibers clinging to sheets. They remain in the note that declared they were never supposed to vanish, only to be replaced. They remain in the memories of those who loved them, frozen as children but imagined as adults. They remain in the unanswered question that still hangs over every file, every vigil, every whispered story told in the town. What really happened to them? No file could answer it. No theory could contain it. No redaction could erase it. The five cousins vanished from a Texas lodge in 1997, and decades later, the truth remains a shadow just beyond reach. Whether they lie beneath the pines or live behind other names, their story is not finished. It lingers, unresolved, in the silence that refuses to let them go. If stories like this one move you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard and remembered, make sure to subscribe. More haunting mysteries and forgotten truths are coming, and you won't want to miss what's revealed next.